Have you ever felt like you weren't truly alone in your own home? Like there's a presence lingering just out of sight, watching you, waiting for the right moment to make itself known? A friend of mine, Sarah, once told me a story that still gives me chills every time I think about it. It was a quiet Friday night, and she had the whole house to herself, something she usually loved. She made herself some tea, put on her favorite movie, and curled up on the couch, ready for a peaceful evening. But as the hours passed, the cozy atmosphere began to shift. At first it was subtle, a faint creak from upstairs like the weight of a footstep. She brushed it off, blaming the old house. Then came the sound of something sliding across the kitchen counter. Though she hadn't been in there for hours, she swore she heard breathing, soft, rhythmic, and close. By the time she noticed the shadow moving in the hallway, her heart was racing. She froze, unable to convince herself it was her imagination anymore. That was just the beginning. What happened next made her question everything she thought she knew about her home and her safety. It started as an ordinary evening, the kind you don't even think twice about. Sarah had just waved goodbye to her parents as they pulled out of the driveway, heading off for a weekend trip. She stood in the doorway of their cozy two-story house, the autumn air crisp against her skin, watching the taillights disappear down the road. The house was hers for the night, and for a 20-something who thrived on independence, that was a dream come true. The house itself was typical of a quiet suburb, the kind of place where the loudest sound at night was the hum of a distant car or the rustle of leaves. Sarah had lived there her whole life, and though it creaked and groaned like all old houses do, it was her safe haven. That night, she had no reason to think anything would be different. She kicked off her shoes, tossed her keys on the counter, and headed to the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. The faint hum of the kettle filled the otherwise silent house, comforting in its familiarity. With a mug in hand, she grabbed a blanket, turned on her favorite show, and sank into the couch. It was the perfect setup for a quiet evening. Just her, the flickering glow of the TV, and the occasional ping of her phone. But then, little things started to stand out. At first, they were so small that she barely registered them. A faint thud from upstairs. She glanced at the ceiling but shrugged it off. Probably the old pipe settling, she thought. A few minutes later, she heard it again. A bit louder this time. It sounded like it was coming from her room. Sarah paused the show and listened, her ears straining against the silence. Nothing. She laughed at herself for being so jumpy and pressed play, diving back into the fictional world on the screen. But as the minutes ticked by, the unease grew. The turning point came when her phone buzzed with a message. She picked it up, expecting a text from a friend, but the screen was blank. Confused, she checked her notifications. Nothing there. The phone buzzed again in her hand, and this time the screen flickered. Her heart skipped a beat. Maybe the device was glitching, she reasoned, but why did it feel like something was watching her? Trying to shake off the feeling, Sarah got up to lock the front door just in case. As she twisted the deadbolt, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass pane. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. But what made her stomach drop was the faint outline of something, or someone, standing behind her, just beyond the doorway. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. She told herself it was her imagination playing tricks. She was tired, alone in a quiet house, and her mind was just being dramatic, right? She turned on a few more lights, filling the house with a warm glow to chase away the shadows. As she sat back down, a new sound broke through the quiet, a scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. This time, it was unmistakable. It came from the kitchen, just a room away. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. She stood, forcing herself to move despite the growing fear clawing at her chest. With each step, the scraping grew louder. She peeked around the corner, expecting to see, well, she didn't know what. The room was empty, but the kitchen chair she'd been sitting on earlier was now pulled out and turned slightly. A chill ran down her spine. She hadn't touched the chair since dinner, and it certainly hadn't been like that before. Her grip on her mug tightened, her pulse pounding in her ears. She told herself to calm down, to stop letting her imagination run wild. But the feeling that she wasn't alone was impossible to shake. Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed her best friend Jess. The line rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. She tried again, and this time the call connected. Jess's voice crackled on the other end. "Sarah? Hello? Are you there?" Relief flooded Sarah's voice as she whispered, "Jess, something's not right. I keep hearing things, and now..." The line cut out. Dead silence. Sarah stared at the screen, the call still active, but no sound came through. Then faintly she heard a voice, not Jess's voice. It was a low, guttural whisper, and it said only one word: "Run!" Her phone slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. Her heart raced as she stared at the device, too afraid to pick it up again. And then she heard it, the faint creak of the stairs. Someone, or something, was coming down. The perfectly normal night had just turned into a nightmare. The chilling discovery. The first few creaks on the stairs could almost be ignored. Old houses made noises, Sarah reminded herself, and she'd grown up in this one. But as the sound continued, methodical, deliberate, her unease turned to outright terror. Someone was upstairs. She stood frozen in the living room, her eyes locked on the staircase at the far end of the hall. The soft glow of a lamp cast long shadows that flickered with every passing second. She strained to listen, her heart hammering in her chest. The steps paused, and for a brief moment, silence settled over the house. Then came another sound, a faint shuffling, like fabric brushing against the wall. The realization hit her like a cold wave. Whoever, or whatever, was upstairs wasn't trying to be quiet. Her first instinct was to grab her phone, but it was still on the floor where she'd dropped it. She tiptoed toward it, the wooden floor creaking beneath her weight. Every sound she made felt amplified in the stillness. She grabbed the phone and turned to face the stairs, but before she could dial, the soft creak of the top step cut through the air. Sarah's breath hitched. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was it a burglar? An animal? Something worse? She dialed Jess again, but the call wouldn't connect. Panic rose in her chest as the shuffling continued, moving closer to the staircase. Desperate for a weapon, she grabbed the fireplace poker from the hearth. Its cold, solid weight in her hands gave her a sliver of courage, though her fingers trembled as she gripped it. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "I don't know who's there, but you need to leave. I've called the police." The house seemed to swallow her words. No reply came, only the oppressive silence that now felt alive, pressing in on her from all sides. Then, just as she thought the silence would drive her mad, the faintest whisper reached her ears. Sarah. Her name, spoken so softly it was almost a breath. Her knees buckled, and she stumbled back against the wall. The voice wasn't familiar. It was guttural, inhuman, and dripping with malice. Her eyes darted to the stairs, expecting to see someone descending, but there was nothing. The shadows at the top seemed to ripple, darker than they should have been. She blinked, her vision blurring with tears she hadn't realized were falling. Then it happened. A shadow, no, a figure, moved at the edge of her vision. It darted from the top of the stairs to the hallway, quick and fluid, like smoke being sucked into a vacuum. It was too fast for her to make out any details, but it was enough to send her heart plummeting into her stomach. She backed away, nearly tripping over the coffee table. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't obey. The oppressive feeling of being watched was now unbearable. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. She knew she was being watched. As she edged toward the front door, her eyes never leaving the staircase, something crashed behind her in the kitchen. The sound of shattering glass made her jump, and she whirled around to see the source. The cabinet door was wide open, and shards of a broken glass littered the counter and floor. She turned back to the stairs, but the shadow was no longer confined to the second floor. It was now at the base of the stairs, just out of reach of the dim light. She couldn't see it fully, but the shape was unmistakable. Tall, hunched, and entirely wrong. "Who are you?" she choked out, barely able to speak. The figure didn't answer. It didn't move. It just stood there, its presence filling the room with a suffocating dread. And then, in one fluid motion, it melted into the darkness, vanishing before her eyes. Sarah's chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath. Her knuckles were white from clutching the poker, but it suddenly felt useless in her hands. She wanted to believe it was all in her head, but the broken glass in the kitchen and the cold, oppressive feeling around her told her otherwise. And then she noticed it, just outside the window, in the reflection of the glass. Eyes, two glowing, unblinking eyes watching her from the shadows of the backyard. She screamed, bolted for the door, and fumbled with the lock. But before she could open it, she heard the whisper again, this time closer. "Run!" The world spun as she stumbled out into the night, leaving the warmth of her house behind. But the one thing she couldn't leave behind was the feeling that those unseen eyes were still watching her, waiting for her to come back. Sarah sprinted across the yard, her bare feet pounding against the cold, damp grass. She didn't dare look back, convinced that whatever had been inside the house was now chasing her. The dark expanse of the neighborhood offered no comfort. Every shadow, every rustling leaf felt alive with menace. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she reached the old tool shed at the far edge of the yard. It wasn't much, just a wooden structure with a padlock that hung loose since the key had been lost years ago. She shoved the door open and stepped inside, collapsing against the wall as she tried to steady her trembling hands. The shed smelled of oil and rust, and in the dim light of her phone screen, she could make out the outlines of garden tools hanging on the walls. A rake, a shovel, a pair of pruning shears. None of it felt like enough. She gripped the poker she'd brought from the house, the cold metal a small but tangible reassurance. The silence was deafening. No footsteps, no whispers. Had she imagined it? She wanted to believe she was safe now, but the air still felt wrong, thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on her chest. And then she heard it, a single knock on the shed door. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the door, willing it to remain closed, praying that the sound had been the wind or a falling branch. But deep down, she knew better. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. No answer, just silence, stretching out like a taut string about to snap. She held her breath, gripping the poker so tightly her knuckles ached. The door creaked open an inch. Sarah froze, her mind screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something. But she couldn't move. Her body betrayed her, paralyzed by a fear so primal it felt like her very soul was under attack. A hand appeared around the edge of the door, pale, gaunt, and inhumanly long. It gripped the wood with unnatural strength, the nails dark and jagged. Slowly, the door swung open wider, revealing a figure that defied explanation. It was tall, its head nearly brushing the low ceiling of the shed. Its body was unnaturally thin, the skin stretched taut over sharp bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its face? Sarah couldn't comprehend its face. It was featureless, save for a wide, jagged mouth that twisted into something resembling a grin. The eyes, however, were the worst. They were the same glowing, unblinking orbs she had seen in the window, filled with a malice so deep it seemed to swallow the light around it. The creature stepped into the shed, its movements unnervingly smooth, as if it were gliding rather than walking. Sarah's grip on the poker tightened as she pressed herself against the wall, every muscle in her body screaming for her to act. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice cracking. She swung the poker wildly, but the creature didn't flinch. It tilted its head as though mocking her feeble attempts to defend herself. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a cacophony of whispers that filled the room. Voices layered on top of each other, some pleading, some screaming, some laughing in a way that made her stomach churn. It was as if the creature carried the echoes of countless souls, all trapped within its grotesque form. Sarah clamped her hands over her ears, but the whispers only grew louder, burrowing into her mind like claws. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to stay grounded, to hold on to her sense of reality. The creature took another step closer, its mouth opening wider, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through her entire body. In a surge of desperation, Sarah lunged forward, swinging the poker with every ounce of strength she had left. The metal connected with the creature's arm, and for a moment it recoiled, letting out an unearthly screech that made her ears ring. She didn't wait to see what would happen next. She shoved past the creature, stumbling out of the shed and into the open yard. The night was eerily quiet again, but she didn't stop running. Her legs carried her to the neighbor's house, where she banged on the door until her fists were raw. When the porch light flicked on and the door opened, she collapsed into their arms, sobbing and incoherent. By the time the police arrived, the shed was empty. The broken lock dangled from the door, but there was no sign of the creature or anything else. To this day, Sarah can't explain what she saw. She moved out of the house shortly after, unable to bear the memories of that night. But even now, in the safety of her new home, she sometimes feels those unseen eyes watching her from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. Even after all this time, Sarah can't escape the shadow of that night. She's tried to move on, convincing herself that it's all in the past, but the memories cling to her like a second skin. It's not just the fear that lingers, it's the unanswered questions, the loose threads that refuse to be tied up neatly. Her life has changed in subtle and profound ways. The carefree confidence she once had in her own home is gone. She now locks every door and window the moment the sun sets, even double-checking them before bed. She's installed motion lights and cameras, but those measures feel hollow because deep down, she knows that whatever was in her house that night doesn't play by the rules of locks and alarms. Sarah talks about it in whispers, only to a select few she trusts, and even then, she chooses her words carefully. She can see the doubt in their eyes when she tells them about the glowing eyes, the whispers, the unearthly figure that invaded her life. They nod politely, offer sympathetic words, but she knows they don't believe her. She wouldn't believe it either, if she hadn't lived through it. She doesn't go near the old house anymore. The idea of stepping foot inside sends a chill down her spine, as if the walls themselves remember the horror they witnessed. Even seeing it from a distance feels wrong, like it's watching her, waiting for her to return. The nightmares haven't stopped. Some nights she dreams of those glowing eyes staring at her from the darkness, the whispers growing louder and louder until they drown out her own thoughts. Other nights it's the sound of footsteps following her, always just out of sight. She wakes up gasping for air, the fear as fresh and raw as it was that night. She's tried to make sense of it, reading about hauntings, cryptids, and urban legends, but none of it fits. It wasn't a ghost or a burglar or even some prank gone wrong. It was something else, something beyond her understanding, and that's what terrifies her the most. What still haunts me, she says, her voice trembling, isn't just what happened that night. It's the question I've never been able to answer. Who or what was really there? And why did it choose me? And as Sarah tells her story, there's a chilling thought that neither of you can ignore. Whatever it was, it's still out there. And maybe, just maybe, it's not done yet.